in the most utopian case, if we develop the perfect labor-saving technology and just cancel any need for human drudgery going forward, and then we develop the ethical and political and economic wherewithal to share the wealth to the perfect degree, whatever that is, answering your questions about what is universal and what is basic, and then people are free to live as creatively and beautifully and organize themselves in any way that they want. You're then left with the problem of what does the average Homo sapien mind do with so much leisure? And how do you find meaning in that context? Do you see that as an easy problem to solve, or is it something that is going to give rise to new pathologies and conflicts of a sort that we can scarcely imagine?
I think it's going to be a very difficult problem and a very interesting problem. I don't think it's impossible to solve it, but it's a very serious challenge. Everything we've so far seen in history indicates that most people will not know what to do with this kind of freedom and leisure. One option that some experts point is that people will just spend more and more time in virtual reality games, three-dimensional virtual worlds, which will provide them with far more excitement and meaning than anything in the real world,
Hmm.
which is one possibility. In a way, again, it's not completely new because you can say that for thousands of years, most people found meaning in playing virtual reality games, which we just called religions. Religion is a huge virtual reality game. You invent certain rules that exist only in your imagination, like you must pray 5 times a day, you shouldn't eat pork, two men shouldn't have sex with one another, and so forth. These laws exist only in your imagination, and you go through life and you try to gain points. I mean, you pray for 5 times a day, you gain points. You have sex with another man, you lose points. If by
Hmm.
the time you die, you have enough points, then you get to the next level, supposedly. And millions of people for thousands of years have found meaning in playing this huge virtual reality game. So this could continue in a different way also in the future. I think the really deep problem with the question of meaning has to do with the structure of the human mind, that Homo sapiens is a storytelling animal. We think in stories, we expect reality to be a story, and we expect the meaning of life also to be a story. When people ask, what is the meaning of life? They almost always expect the answer to come in the shape of a story. Some huge cosmic drama with a beginning and middle and end, and heroes and villains and so forth, and very important, with a role for me to play in the drama, in the big story. And I think the problem is that reality doesn't come in the shape of a story. I think, as a kind of a rule of thumb, if the meaning of life that you think you have found is in the shape of a story, it's wrong. It's a human invention. And how to overcome that, I don't think we are anywhere near knowing the answer to that one.
It's interesting there because, and I noticed at one point in your book, you said something a little skeptical about my conception of the moral landscape, the idea that there can be right answers to questions of good and evil or right and wrong or human values. But I see it as very much of a piece with what you just expressed there, the idea that the meaning of life is not a matter of having the right story about it. And even if you get rid of all stories or admit that all stories don't have really deep roots in reality, there still is just the fact that we live in a universe where certain experiences are possible. And we are navigating in this space, and we're navigating without a map or without or with a very primitive map. And whatever our stories and their utility, there still is a difference between excruciating and pointless misery and far more sublime and desirable states of consciousness. Again, whatever stories we tell ourselves or whether we tell ourselves any, we must navigate. We have no choice but to navigate. We keep moving toward things that are painful. And sometimes these pains lead to better things on the other side, and we're surprised that the pain had a purpose. And sometimes it's just getting worse and worse, and we know we want to move in another direction, whether individually or collectively. And so we have
Mhm.
this navigation problem. And the possibilities there that await us are absolutely the result of however reality is. And if we can integrate our minds with technology that allows us to, as you say, fudge this boundary between fiction and fact, and we can live in a kind of Aldous Huxley dystopia or utopia, depending on how you look at it, where everyone is lost in his own dream world of virtual reality or some other thing that is just the product of the human imagination, well, then we may not be at base level reality anymore, but we're still partaking of states of consciousness that are possible. And our exploration in those domains is, again, constrained by what is possible. And so I see us as navigating in this space, and things can go wonderfully right or disastrously wrong based on how it is certain experiences become possible. Do you agree with that, or is there some way in which you're not converging with me there?
No, I think I agree. I mean, certainly suffering is real. I mean, sometimes misery and suffering and pain are caused by some story in which people believed, but it doesn't matter. The suffering itself is real. I would say that if you really want to explore reality, the best place to start is with suffering because it's the most real thing in the world. With happiness, it's very difficult to tell whether, many times people tell themselves, oh, I'm very happy. And actually, they are not. They are deluding themselves. And that's difficult. But with suffering, it's usually much easier to know. So, yes, this is definitely real.
Although even there, suffering is amenable to being reconstrued based on the conceptual frame you put around it. So if you've ever engaged in a very intense athletic event, say, or people who have trained to be the kinds of elite soldiers you just referenced, Navy SEALs, they go through something like a physical hell. If you imposed that training on some unsuspecting person against his will, you would be guilty of torturing them, right? And yet people willingly do this because they have a goal that they're in touch with and they want to get to the other side of this physical ordeal. It's not viewed as torture. And in fact, when they look back on it, it's some of the most positive experience they've had, even though if you could sample their moment to moment experience while enduring it, they were in agony. As you must know from meditation, there are experiences of extraordinarily intense sensation when you're sitting for hours with, a pain in your knee, for instance, where it becomes genuinely difficult to tell whether what you're experiencing is agony or ecstasy. It's sheer intensity. If you have a true equanimity of attention at that moment, the difference almost doesn't matter. So there is something paradoxical even about suffering when you really pay attention to it.
Yes, definitely. Suffering, it's also a very complex matter. I would say that suffering certainly isn't pain. Suffering is generated by the mind. It's the reaction of the mind that is suffering.
Right.
It's not the objective condition in the outside world. It's not even the sensations in the body. In the body, you can have pain, you can have pressure, you can have heat. This is not suffering. The suffering is the reaction of the mind. The mind, for some reason, it doesn't matter what the reason is, for some reason, the mind doesn't like something and reacts by generating suffering, by trying to push it away, by hating this thing.
Yeah.
And this is the suffering, the reaction of the mind. And it's not easy to see it, of course, but and therefore also just as happiness is not obvious what it is, So also is suffering. It's not obvious what it is, but in the end, this is the most real thing in the world.
Well, that's a fascinating claim because given that it's vulnerable to inspection in the way that we've described, given that is an illusory component to suffering. In fact, once you realize that it is at the level of a story as opposed to at the level of the raw, painful sensation, it is somewhat paradoxical to say that it's the most real thing in the world. It's certainly real in terms of its motivational consequences. People are again, going to war or just initiating the great sweeps of history based on what they want out of life and being driven by the goad of suffering in one direction or another. But the person who is just told that, the pile of paper in his bag worth $1 million just went up in flames and he begins to suffer over it, it's odd to describe that principle as the most real thing in the world.
For that person, at that moment, the intense misery he experiences, this is the most real thing in the world. Now, the cause of the misery may be an illusion or several illusions stuck one on top of the other.
Mm,
But the actual experience for that person at that moment, this is the reality for him.
yeah.
And in Western philosophy, you see it very, very clearly, I think, with Descartes, that he goes on this expedition of doubting the whole world. And how do I know, like the Matrix, how do I know that the trees and then the sky and the other people, how do I know that anything really exists? And how can I trust anything? And in the end, he comes to the point when the only thing he can trust is his own momentary mental state. His very doubt, the thought, is the only thing he can trust. And then, of course, he makes a terrible mistake. He says, I think, therefore I am.
Mm,
And he invents the I out of nowhere. He should have said, there is thought, therefore there is thought. But no, because I think of the Christian tradition, he couldn't get rid of it. And he invented a self, an I, that thinks the thought. And once he began inventing, very quickly, he also somehow managed to invent God and bring him into the picture and so forth and so on.
yeah.
But if you go with the radical doubt of Descartes, then you see that the only thing you cannot doubt is your own momentary mental state right now. In this sense, this is the most real thing in the world.
The phrase I've used on this podcast and elsewhere is that consciousness is the one thing in this universe that cannot be an illusion. Because
Exactly.
even if you're radically confused about everything, even if you're not at the base layer of reality and you're in the hard drive of some alien supercomputer and confused about everything, this is the modern equivalent of being a brain in a vat, you still can't deny that something seems to be happening. And that seeming is as much a demonstration of consciousness as anything else.
Yeah, exactly.